A massive silhouette looms through the gray mist of the Atlantic, its 5 masts towering over the choppy water. This is the Carroll A. Deering, a 5-masted commercial schooner out of Bath, Maine. She's an 1,879-ton wooden giant of the sea. But as the rescuers arrive, they find something that defies logic. The deck is silent. No voices, no movement, just a long, breathless silence. No one is on board. The boarding party finds the ship completely empty of people. All 11 crew members have vanished. The only living things left on this abandoned vessel are 3 half-starved cats. We will explore the specific, disturbing details that lead to a theory of a mutiny that ended in tragedy. Subscribe to join us as we dive deeper into history's most unsettling mysteries. Cold Atlantic winds whip across the Diamond Shoals, a place known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. Here, the sand shifts like a living thing, and boiling breakers tear through anything that drifts too close. On January 31st, 1921, surfman C.P. Brady looked out over the white foam and saw it. A ghost. A 5-masted schooner, grounded and silent. This was the Carroll A. Deering, a titan of a bygone era. She was 255 feet long and weighed 1,879 tons. To look at her was to see one of the last great wooden sailing vessels ever built, a massive wall of timber and canvas fighting a losing battle against the tide. The shoals do not forgive mistakes, and they certainly do not return what they take. April 4th, 1919, in Bath, Maine, the G.G. Deering Company launched a vessel that was meant to be a legacy. Named after the owner's son, the Carroll A. Deering was a masterwork of wooden shipbuilding. For the first 2 years, the vessel was steered by Captain William Merritt, a World War I hero who had once saved his entire crew during a previous sinking. He was the steady hand the ship needed. But the tide turned in September 1920. Merritt fell seriously ill, and the command shifted to Willis Wormel. Wormel was a 66-year-old veteran mariner from Portland, Maine. On paper, he was experienced, but the man was fading. His eyesight was deteriorating, and the darkness of the Atlantic was becoming a blur. Because of Wormel's poor eyesight, the actual weight of the command shifted. First Mate Charles McClellan took over most of the navigation. It was a dangerous arrangement. The aging captain, a man who was dying in plain sight, and a first mate who now held the real power. The crew didn't just lose their steering gear later. They lost their leadership long before the ship ever hit the shoals. August 1920, Norfolk, Virginia. The Carroll A. Deering is weighing anchor, her hold full of heavy coal for Rio de Janeiro. It is a routine voyage, but the atmosphere on deck is shifting. By late December 1920, the ship stops in Bridgetown, Barbados, for supplies and rest. Here, the mask slips. Captain Willis Wormel tells Captain Hugh Norton that he is having serious trouble with First Mate Charles McClellan. The tension is not a subtle thing. It is a poison. McClellan is described as habitually drunk while ashore and mistreating the crew. He feels a deep resentment because he is doing the captain's work without the captain's authority. While in Barbados, McClellan is overheard saying, "I will get the captain before we get to Norfolk. I will." It is a direct threat. On January 9th, 1921, Charles McClellan is arrested for drunkenness in Barbados and bailed out by Captain Wormel. The captain's kindness is a mistake. He saves the man who has just promised to kill him. January 28th, 1921, brings us to the final recorded sighting of the ship. The Carroll A Deering passed the Cape Lookout lightship, gliding through the North Carolina waters. But the interaction that followed was wrong. Captain Thomas Jacobson, stationed on the lightship, didn't speak with Captain Wormell. Instead, he was hailed by a man with a foreign accent and reddish hair, shouting through a megaphone. This man was tall and thin, possibly Scandinavian. This man was not the captain. Through the megaphone, the unidentified crewman reported a disaster. The ship had lost both anchors in a storm off Cape Fear. But as Captain Thomas Jacobson looked across the water, he saw something even more unsettling. The crew was milling around on the quarterdeck. In the strict hierarchy of a 1921 schooner, the quarterdeck was reserved for the captain. For ordinary sailors to be wandering about there was an unusual practice, almost unheard of. The command structure hadn't just slipped. It had vanished. January 29th, 1921 marks the point where the ship became a ghost. Another vessel spotted the Deering sailing on a course that would take her directly onto the Diamond Shoals. She was moving, but she was dead. On February 4th, 1921, at 9:30 a.m., a boarding party led by Captain James Carlson finally reached the Carroll A Deering. They expected a rescue mission, but they found a tomb. As they stepped onto the deck, the silence was absolute. Only 3 half-starved cats, 6-toed cats, were the only living things found on board. Captain James Carlson and his men moved into the galley. The scene was frozen. Food had been laid out for the next meal, with pots on the stove and coffee made. It looked as if the crew had just stepped away for a second, but the food was untouched. Then the investigation shifted. The personal belongings, sea chests, and bags of the crew were all missing. The ship's log and all navigation equipment were gone. Everything that could tell us where they went, the logs, the navigational aids, had been stripped. 2 lifeboats were missing and appeared to have been deliberately launched. A ladder hung over the side of the ship. The sails were still set. The men were gone. 11 men vanished from a sound ship. The silence on that deck was not a mistake. It was a deliberate erasure. Step inside the navigation room. The charts and maps were still there, but the records were wrong. Handwritten notes in the margins of the charts and maps showed a change in handwriting after January 23rd, 1921. A different hand had taken over the logs. Then you walk back to the deck. The destruction was not accidental. The ship's wheel was shattered. The binnacle box was smashed, and the rudder had been disengaged from its stock. Someone had gone to the great effort of ensuring the vessel could not be steered. It was not a storm that broke the steering wheel. It was a hammer. The ship was aimed at the shoals like a weapon. And then the crew vanished. 11 men, including Captain Willis Wormell and his volatile first mate, Charles McClellan, along with 9 crew members, vanished as if they were never there. The authorities struggled to comprehend how a schooner could surrender its entire complement while leaving the vessel itself to drift onto the shoals. Speculation filled the void. Whispers of Bolshevik piracy and bootleggers operating under the cloak of prohibition crowded the docks. The investigation was not a localized inquiry. It was a desperate, high-level demand for answers, initiated by Captain W.B. Wormel's wife. The federal response was unprecedented, involving 5 government departments: Commerce, Treasury, Justice, Navy, and State. The government search teams scoured the Atlantic, hunting for signs of a struggle or a clue to the mass exodus. They found nothing. No bodies of the 11 men ever washed ashore. No lifeboat wreckage was ever positively identified. The investigation became a chronicle of what was missing: the crew, the ship's log, the navigation equipment, and all definitive explanations. It was a fruitless search that left the fate of those 11 buried deep within the cold, shifting dark. Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce and a future U.S. President, took a personal interest in the case. He didn't see the Deering as an isolated incident. He saw a pattern. On January 25, 1921, the sulfur freighter Hewitt, also known as the SS Hewitt, had disappeared in the same general area and period as the Deering. This was not a small-scale disappearance. The Hewitt had a crew of 42 men. It had departed Sabine Pass, Port Arthur, Texas, on a course from Sabine, Texas to Boston and Portland, Maine. The loss of 42 men from the SS Hewitt and 11 from the crew of the Deering on the same stretch of water during the same winter was a mathematical nightmare. That's a total of 53 men gone, vanished into the Atlantic. 11 men, a prepared meal on the stove, and 3 six-toed cats who stared at the rescuers in a dead silence. The Carroll A. Deering didn't just run aground, it was in erasure. The ship's wheel was smashed by a hammer, the logs were stripped, and the rudder was disengaged. Everything that pointed to a Marxist pirate raid or a rum-running plot was a shadow. But the most terrifying part is the total absence of any remains. Not a single body, not a single scrap of wreckage from the lifeboats. The Atlantic is a vast, cold void that does not return what it takes. Years later, the timbers of the Deering were sold off and used to build houses on the Outer Banks. People now live in the walls of a ship that witnessed a mass disappearance. People sleep in the walls of a ghost ship. They just don't know it. The 11 men remain in the deep, and the Atlantic remains silent. If you enjoyed this mystery, please follow the channel for more stories of the unexplained.